Welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay. I'm joined by Eric Stearns, and today we're digging into doubting Thomas and seeing if there's more to Thomas than meets the eye and more to this story than just a guy that doubted. So welcome here. Glad you've joined us. Let's get into the conversation.
We're reading out of Luke 24.
Yep.
For the home medals this week.
Uh-huh.
That story is of these two men walking down the road, and Jesus appears to them, next to them, but he doesn't tell them he's Jesus.
Right.
And they don't recognize him as
Yep.
Jesus. Is that happening during this time where Jesus also appears to Thomas? Or like what's the chronology of all these stories in the different Gospels?
That's a great question, because it does get a little bit muddy, because Jesus appears to, in the morning of the morning of resurrection, Jesus appears to at least Mary Magdalene and then maybe some other women. And then in the evening, it's the disciples. And yes, there are these two men in the Gospel of Luke that are on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus is with them too, and physically present with them. So I can't nail down for you an exact timeline, but that was all on the day of resurrection.
Okay.
So my impression, this is just me, so it's just my opinion. I believe that the order of events was Jesus appears to the women go to the disciples doubt it. They go to the tomb, they're left to wonder. Early afternoon, they get Jesus and the disciples in the Gospel of John. And then later that day, because in the road to Emmaus story, we are told that they stop for the night and invite Jesus to dwell with them. Mm-hmm. And then they break bread for the evening meal, and that's how Jesus reveals himself, is in the breaking of bread and the sharing of a meal together with these other disciples that aren't the 12, but are clearly followers of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And that's all on that one day of resurrection.
Sure. So if they were clearly followers of Jesus, they would have recognized him.
Yeah.
In his normal earthly body. So
yep.
How does he not reveal himself? I mean, how did they not recognize him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Mary had the same experience in the garden. Mary thought that Jesus was the gardener.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we don't necessarily know. I just think that it has to do with the fact that the resurrection changed Jesus in some way, but also not enough that his wounds weren't recognizable to the disciples, because that's how he proves himself, especially in John's gospel, is by telling the disciples to behold his body and to see the nail prints, to see the spear marks, to witness the effects of that week on his physical body. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if he was, intentionally disguising himself, or if maybe the grief was just that thick, seeing your dead friend, you might not be expecting it. Mm-hmm. And it could have been one of those, he kind of looks like him, but he can't be him because he's dead. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, oh, wait, no. Oh. Mm-hmm. It's making those recognitions that it's Jesus.
Well, that kind of makes sense, because even with Thomas, he has to see the holes in his hands and the scar and his wounds in his side,
right? And
then he says, "My Lord and my God."
Right.
He has to go through that process first before this is actually him.
Right. Yeah. This is legit Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So as I've read the different stories from the different Gospels, it's interesting how they're all different, but in a way they kind of they're all talking about the same thing.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It's
just
different.
That Jesus does what the person needs in order for them to really get it. Mm-hmm. Like in John's gospel, the telling of the resurrection with Mary Magdalene, it's not until Jesus says her name that she finally recognizes that it's Jesus. And one of the commentaries I read on that passage a long time ago that's just stuck with me is that Jesus says one word that just so encapsulates all of who she is, and it's her name. And like in that moment, she is so known that she knows it just has to be Jesus. And that's so cool to me that, someone can know just by the calling of a name. I mean, it's like what our parents can do. It's that same power. Like, I know that when my mom says my name, I mean, I'm 33 years old, but when my mom says my name in a certain way, buddy, you better listen up. Like, she is naming you, you
Right.
know, and that can be both a good and a bad thing. Like, that can be in a moment of I am in pain and I need compassion, and it can also be in a moment of I'm a moron and I need you to kick my butt. And it's just the naming of the person that does that.
So Thomas, he needs Jesus to appear to him. Like, he followed him for 3 years and still needs that, or even any of the disciples.
Right.
They followed him for 3 years and still struggle with doubt that Jesus really came back to life,
Right.
Do you find that? I just find that interesting and
Oh,
fascinating.
I do too. I just think it gives so much hope for all of us. I mean, we have the disadvantage of being so removed from the story. Like, I believe that the fresh wind of the Spirit blows through the word all the time, but like, we weren't there. We are now living 2,000 some odd years later. It's different. But the disciples were right there, and they still needed a little bit of help. Gives me just so much hope.
Right.
That I'm not lost and useless. I'm found and useful in the eyes of God.
Yeah. And I just feel like you said, I mean, kind of along those lines, I think people struggle sometimes to relate to what the Bible is trying to tell them. If you can't relate to this story in particular,
Right.
I just don't know what you can relate to, just in general, because we all struggle with doubt of this. This in particular, or doubt of anything.
Right.
But for people to follow him for so long and still doubt after the events that happened, and they would have understood the Old Testament better than we do, and to still doubt and
Right.
and all of you think about all of the passages that foretold of this happening, and they still doubted.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. To have the prophet Isaiah's description of the suffering servant, and to then look at Jesus and then not automatically make the connection. I mean, I know that that's us reading Jesus into that Old Testament text, but like, I mean, come on. I mean, he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our sins. Who else could that have been but Jesus?
Right.
And to have those advantages of knowing the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament better than us, or to still need help to get it. Yeah, it's huge.
I guess hindsight's 20/20.
Right?
We got to see the whole picture, and
Right, exactly.
they were
That's very true.
experiencing it.
Yep.
So I mean that
Yep.
that
And
does change things.
Yeah, and that's where our distance is an advantage, where we can have, years of Christian tradition to look back on that, says that suffering servant is what we're talking about in Jesus.
So why Thomas? Like, why was Thomas called out? Is there any insight into that?
Thomas is the one to ask good questions in the Gospel of John. When Jesus says to the disciples in John 14 that I go to prepare a place for you, I'm not going to be here for a while, but you know the way to the place that I'm going. It's Thomas that says, Lord, we have no idea where you're going. And Jesus says, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. Like, that moment happens because Thomas asks a question. And maybe that's Thomas doubting what Jesus is saying, even in that moment in John chapter 14, and now we're in John 20. But I just think that it's Thomas because he is the one that asks questions. And that's just, that's two little glimpses into who he is.
It feels like Thomas is so relatable.
Oh, yeah.
With John chapter 14 and this, it just feels like he's one of us.
Yeah.
And he just...
Yep. Yeah. He's just a dude that happened to follow Jesus, and who is that if not us?
So what did Thomas do after?
Yeah.
after this?
So one of the things I mentioned on Sunday was that Thomas was more than this one moment. And that's absolutely true, because what we are told through history and what we're told through tradition is that Thomas is the one who takes the gospel right where the disciples are at the moment is called Asia Minor, because it's the Middle East and it's that lower part of Asia. And what we're told is that Thomas's ministry is to the east, that Thomas takes the gospel from, Palestine to the nation of India. That's really where his ministry is most found. There are actually Christians in India that are called St. Thomas Christians because they were converted by Thomas.
Really?
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep.
Well, most of the disciples were killed for what they were preaching. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thomas was also killed in India for what he was preaching?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. How long did he spend in India before he was killed?
Right.
Do we know?
We don't, well, we kind of know, because the tradition is that Jesus' death was in AD 33. What we've learned from history is that Thomas's death was in AD 72. And so there is a 40-year period there, basically, where Thomas would, it took a while for the disciples to get there. It took a while for the disciples to kind of get on board. And that's just that's part of how Jesus commissioned them. Because in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, which is one of my very, very, very favorite passages of Scripture, Jesus tells them to be witnesses to Judea, to be witnesses in the region where they physically are at the moment that Jesus is talking to them, and then out to the broader regions of Samaria that would have been geographically further, and then to the ends of the earth. So I can't just say that Thomas's ministry to India was 40 years, because that's disingenuous to the call of God. It took them a while to build that network to that where passage to India would have been safe. But what we learn is that in AD 70, Thomas was preaching in a place called Kerala, where he converted 40 Jews and 3,000 Buddhists to Christianity. And that kind of got people's attention. And then he was taken across the continent of India to Mylapore, where he insulted the Kali priests, and it was those priests that ended up putting him to death for his faith.
Interesting.
Because he had insulted these priests by making fun of the god Kali, as a way of proclaiming the gospel of Jesus and proclaiming Yahweh. And so it was there where he was put to death.
How long would it? Because they would have spent time in Samaria. It would have taken them a while to get to India to begin with.
Yep.
That's interesting.
But that's really the heritage and the tradition of what happened to Thomas after this moment, is that he is the one to take the gospel further east to India. Like as we get into the book of Acts, you start reading more about Paul and Peter, and like their mission was west. Like Paul's goal and heart of hearts was to bring the gospel all the way to Spain. We'll get into this later next fall, but there's some tradition that says that he got to Spain and then went back to Rome to be martyred. And so their expansion was west, where Thomas's was very much to the East Indies.
Do we know much about any of the other disciples?
We all know that we know that they were all martyred except for John, who was exiled onto Patmos. That Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be killed in the same way that Jesus was. He didn't feel worthy of that. There's tradition out there about where all of the disciples ended up. There's actually a really cool book by Pope Benedict that was written right before he was elected Pope that talks about the tradition of all the apostles. It's a book that's on my shelf. So
good to know.
If you're ever really curious, you can just come to my office.
Yeah, there you go.
Yep.
We've talked about how the Gospels were written later.
Yes.
When was this Gospel written? Like, when would John have written this? And how does that fit? No, that doesn't work. Judging on that face, that doesn't work.
Not without.
So we know John was written, 30 to 40 years after Jesus' life.
Yep, in that ballpark.
What would have been going on during the time that he had written his gospel?
Yeah. So, as we've talked about on previous episodes, early Christians believed that Jesus was going to return in their actual lifetime. And so, like a lot of the Apostle Paul, we have to read with that in mind, because this would have been kind of contemporary to him. And so, what was starting to happen was that Christians were starting to die of old age and natural causes, and also persecution, because that's what's happening. And because Christianity is not a legal thing, there are political leaders trying to figure out what in the world to do with these Christians that won't worship an emperor, but worship God and worship this guy named Jesus. And so they're being persecuted and being put to death, but yet they had this belief that Jesus was coming back before they would die. And so people are starting to fall away from faith. They are starting to have these moments of doubt that they have been had, that the story isn't true, that Jesus isn't the Messiah. And so there's a gospel written to say no. And especially because the world was becoming more Hellenistic, more Greek influenced in that time. And so that's why John's gospel opens the way that it does in John chapter 1, talking about the Word. And the word in Greek is logos. And that's a philosophical concept to the people that would have been reading John's gospel first. And so John is solidifying the identity of Jesus in this Hellenistic world, that he is the eternal logic of God. He is the Word of God that was with God in the beginning, and not only with God in the beginning, is God. And so that's why he dwells on that for the first 14 verses of the gospel, is to talk to the world that he's talking to help them deal with who Jesus really is. And so every story in the gospel, the Gospel of John is the gospel of signs and miracles. There are signs and miracles that happen all throughout the Gospels, like the wedding at Cana is a sign and a miracle. The healings that happen, the teachings that happen, and then the resurrection, that's another sign and another miracle, just to prove that Jesus is who he says he is to a world that is starting to doubt. And so part of why we have this story in particular in the Gospel of John is that because people are starting to believe less and less and starting to have doubts more and more. And so John, in his wisdom, tells this true story of when an actual disciple of Jesus, who lived the life of following Jesus for these 3 years of earthly ministry, witnessed all that took place, all that happened, and yet he also struggled with doubt. And so this story was a breadcrumb for them to hang on to and understand, oh, these disciples that were with Jesus also struggled with this doubt. I'm not the worst thing in the world because I'm having these doubts. And either are my friends. And it's not, death is still sad, don't get me wrong, but we can still believe in Jesus, because here is this story of Thomas, the disciple, the one that brought the gospel to India. Like, this is the story of him having a moment, a human, understandable, and relatable moment of doubting this good news of the resurrection. And so here comes Jesus into the midst of it. Like, the disciples have this cool moment with Jesus. Thomas doesn't. He's feeling burned by it and says, I won't believe unless I do, the things that you were able to do. And here a week later comes Jesus. And Thomas is there. And Thomas gets what he needs in order to believe. And that is a promise for all of us. Like, that is a promise that even as now we as contemporary Christians, like, deal with the fact that doubt is real and that we all struggle with it. Here is this little story. Here is this story of an actual disciple of Jesus Christ that walked with him in the flesh, doubting, and still being used by God in mighty ways. It just gives us so much hope and so much. It affirms the fact that our doubt is not disqualifying from God's work in our lives. Like, that our doubt doesn't, that not only is our doubt okay, like our doubt is an opportunity for Jesus to work in and through our lives. And so when we go through those moments of doubt, when we have that experience for ourselves, we can know how Jesus acted. And the best predictor of future results is past results.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can look to Jesus' past behavior to know how Jesus will deal with us. And so in our doubts, Jesus will meet us. In our doubts, Jesus will find us. In our doubts, Jesus will ignite something new within us or outside of us, but he'll get our attention somehow and say, I get it. I get what you're feeling, and I got this, and I've got you. And just thanks be to God that that's the truth. Because I know that I need that from time to time, and I know that others do too.
Mm-hmm. It's probably one of the most hopeful things we've had come out of this podcast is that sentiment right there. I think that wraps it up on the crucifixion and the Easter side of things.
Yep.
So now we move on to Camp Sunday, which is probably the best Sunday of the year besides Easter and Christmas Eve.
Right.
So
yeah.
The Dakota's camps are, in my opinion, the best camps in the world.
I've
never been anywhere else, but I've got to imagine that between the three that we have, it doesn't get much better than that.
Yep. I will say I am the past chair of the Camp and Retreat Council. I'm the past co-chair. I was the Dakota's conference chair and worked very closely with the Minnesota camps. And if you happen to be in Minnesota or closer to Minnesota than South Dakota and North Dakota, you got some good camps there too at Coronis Ministries and Kewaukenet Adventures and Northern Pines. So I have personally been to Coronis and to Northern Pines, and they are fantastic spots too.
So what do we have in store for Camp Sunday?
Yeah, so Camp Sunday is going to be basically a week of camp in the midst of one worship service. We are going to play a get-to-know-you game at the start of church on Sunday, and I'm super excited about it. I can tell Eric's excited too. We will have some really cool videos that the conference has prepared for us to use. So we'll get a chance to actually meet all of our site directors in both Dakotas and Minnesota areas. We'll get to meet our camping director, Keith Shue, a dear friend of mine, again, because I was on the council for a while. And then just get to hear about what our curriculum is going to be about. And it's all centered around prayer. Every day of the week of camp this week is focused on prayer and about how we cry out to God and how God hears us. And just talking more about God's nature and God's character that way and what we can hope to expect at our camps this summer. So I'm super excited about Camp Sunday.
That sounds great. Camp has been a huge impact in my life. I went many, many years, and it will always have a special spot for us.
I am the same way.
Taking Avenel to Teddy Bear Camp this summer, and our kids will be going forever. So
yes, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yep, cool. We'll talk more about that next week on the podcast.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for this week's podcast. Join us again next week on Sunday, and then hit us back up on the podcast later in the week. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.